I want to talk about Project Esther because this is part of all of that. And can you go just a little bit more into depth about the sort of genesis of Project Esther and where that came from? Because you really started your Substack journey with Project 2025.
Mhm.
And back in those days, everyone was like, oh, it's a conspiracy theory. It's, and now everyone is in pretty much agreement that this is the plan.
Yeah. I
So
mean, my
tell us more
Substack
about,
then was called How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. And I guess I could call it now How Project 2025 is Ruining Your Life,
yes.
because and the planet, because they've done over 50% of it. But
Yeah.
Project Esther it wasn't part of Project 2025 specifically, even though they teased it in Project 2025. But they, in October of 2024, published a whole separate paper that they named Project Esther. And they said it was for the sole purpose of prosecuting Gaza protesters, Palestinian protesters, as being anti-Semitic. And so, that was the thing they used to say we need to have a means of going after people who are domestic terrorists. Anti-Semitism is domestic terrorism, and we need to have a means to go after that kind of speech and expression that's separate from the First Amendment. It was their first real attack at free speech and expression with the First Amendment. And I said then, this is the regime's firing shot to do away with the First Amendment and say any form of dissent is terrorism. I explained that in detail. I spent a whole week on it last May. And then in the fall, the regime put out NSPM-7, which expanded the net from just these Gaza protesters, Palestinian protesters, to the list that I just named of people who could be considered to be domestic terrorists or Antifa. That's how they wanted to term everything. So they have a detailed checklist that they're following. And the end result of that checklist is going to be all dissent of any kind is labeled domestic terrorism. And that could be even as simple as, well, you're violating the gender prohibitions that we have
Right.
in NSPM-7 by having a rainbow flag on your social media profile. You're violating that by saying your pronouns in a signature. You're violating that by going to a drag show and having a good time, and somebody captured your face and image there, and we know that you went to that. And so therefore you're a domestic terrorist. It's a way, I don't know, I don't like to use movie references because sometimes they date people and sometimes people don't know what I'm talking about here. But it's a way to make Minority Report come true, where they had this whole pre-crime division. And people could be arrested for things before they did it, based on, in the movie, these people who could see the future saying this was going to happen. But they're building a surveillance system where they will use AI to rate whether or not you might do something someday against the regime based on what you're doing in real life. So that's what NSPM-7 is really designed to ultimately bring about.
And you've said, being anti-American is really questioning the regime. Like, it's not about our government. It's about our regime that is overall. Anti-capitalism is whistleblowing on corruption or billionaire profit. Overthrow the U.S. government means voting Democrat, right? Or donating to Democrats. Extremism
or doing
on
this
race.
show, it's
Doing a show. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I feel I wear that with a badge. Hostility to traditional values is saying let's agree to disagree. It is stifling all debate. What can we go back just one second? Why Project Esther? Why did they call it that?
Well, my Substack for such a time as this is from the Book of Esther. It's something that her uncle said to her, according to the Bible, in the Book of Esther. The Feast of Purim in the Hebrew, the Jewish faith, Judaism, is drawn from that story where Esther saved her people from slaughter by approaching for being the most beautiful woman in the kingdom and got to be his primary queen, and she couldn't approach her husband without being invited, or she could be killed, executed. That's how that Babylonian regime worked. And so she approached him anyway to plead for the Jewish people. And he didn't order her to be executed. When he found out what had been happening in his own cabinet, he changed a law so that the Jews could fight back against being a genocide. So the Feast of Purim celebrates that story.
I see.
And so that's why they called it Project Esther. They tried to tie it to, we're here to save the Jewish people for such a time as this. That's really why we need this kind of restriction on speech and expression, because, Israel is under threat and Israel is being destroyed, and they're fighting for their right to exist. And these Palestinian protesters in Gaza, adherents are terrible, and all these protests are terrible, and we need to make that stop. And so they were trying to draw a line between the story of Esther and make them like Haman in that story, who wanted all of the Jews to be killed. So
Wow.
that's the line that they're trying to draw with calling it Project Esther. But they dispensed with all of that with NSPM 7, which is the next iteration
Right.
of Project Esther from inside the regime.